Well, thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. So, this is Science by the Glass. So, we will start by talking about beer. And I just want to remind you that it takes about 20 gallons of water to make a pint of beer. So, as you sip through that beer, I want you to keep in mind the water that goes into the production of the beer. And what I show on this title slide is a typical dug well. These types of wells are very common in India and Africa and other parts of the world. They're dug by hand. And we used to have, when I was growing up, we had a similar type of dug well in our house, which we use for non-potable purposes to water our lawn or like water plants and such. And right around 1980s, our neighbor took his dug well and then converted it into a bore well. So he dug deeper and put a pump on it and started producing water. And then our dug well, which was relying on a perched aquifer to get some of that water, went dry. And then a lot of people told my dad that he should drill another well that's a little bit more deeper to get more water. But of course, being an economist, he said that was a mad race that would simply end up having both our wells going dry. So he converted that well to a sump and started storing water and used in other ways. And of course, growing up in India, which depends very heavily on monsoonal rainfalls, water is always a big issue. And then growing up in the southern parts of India, where we have mostly hard rock aquifers, finding groundwater was not easy. So that got me interested in groundwater issues, and later about how climate interacts with groundwater. So before I get into talking about climate and groundwater interactions, I just want to start off by talking about aquifers. Aquifers are essentially a geologic resource. It's a subsurface resource that provides water of sufficient quantity and quality for human use. So aquifers have a very anthropocentric definition, and they can be classified in many ways. Very typically, we use the geologic definitions, which are the sand and gravel aquifers. These aquifers, as I show here, with a screen and sand formations, they essentially tap into the sand underneath our feet, and then that are saturated with water. And then we typically use a well to pump water out of that formation. The other type of formation is the hard rock aquifer, and here I show you an hard rock aquifer, a picture of hard rock aquifer, and then water flows through conduits between hard rocks, or typically igneous rocks and such. And then the third type of formation is the karst formation. And the karst formations are essentially formations in soft rock, especially calcite deposits, where water cuts through the calcite and then forms conduits and then has water flow through those conduits. So Texas is a great test place to study all these types of aquifers, and of course the climate stresses on this aquifers vary across across different formations. Talk a little bit about groundwater. Groundwater is the most extracted resource on Earth. We have the estimates that we use about 1,000 kilometer cube per year of that water worldwide. That translates to about 356 billion 2-gallon jugs per day. That's a lot of water, and a lot of that is used for agricultural purposes. Nearly 70% of the extracted groundwater is used for agriculture. Groundwater also provides about 50% of all the drinking water used worldwide. About 38% of the irrigated lands in the world have some sort of groundwater infrastructure or are groundwater dependent. When it comes to high plains, we don't have reliable surface water sources, so most of our water tends to be groundwater. So almost 100% of our irrigated lands is done using use groundwater. If you look at that water that's underneath the earth, there is about 22.6 million kilometer cube of water in the upper 2 kilometers of the earth crust, but a very small fraction of it actually is less than 50 years old. So a lot of that groundwater has deposited over millions of years. So I like to think of groundwater as your grandma's inheritance, or something that has been passed on to us from previous generations. So it behooves upon us to leave that groundwater aquifers in good shape for future generations as well. Coming back to aquifers, in Texas, as I said, we are blessed to have many different types of aquifers. And our availability is about 12.5 billion gallons per year, or about 14 million acre feet per year. And we currently use about 6.24 billion gallons per year, or roughly 7 million, or about 50% of what's available as groundwater estimated available is what we use. Then Texas has 9 major aquifers and 22 minor aquifers. So there are a variety of different types of aquifers. We have the sand and gravel aquifers. The Ogallala aquifer is the largest aquifer in the U.S. A big portion of that, about 20% of that, lies in Texas. And that's a classic sand and gravel unconfined aquifer. I'm also going to be talking about Edwards Aquifer, which is a karst formation that lies along the I-35 corridor, particularly serving San Antonio and Austin region. And if you go a little west to us, we have the bolsons, which are the more hard rock type formations. So, in Texas, we have several different types of aquifers. In addition, there are many other aquifers in the world, and I'll be briefly touching upon some of the aquifers in India, like, some of the groundwater issues in India and China, two very large areas with a lot of population and growing use of groundwater in these countries. So when we talk about groundwater and climate, there are some direct interactions between climate and groundwater. Even though groundwater is deep underground, there are opportunities for it to interact with the climate. So I'll be talking about how groundwater impacts climate. But a lot of climate interactions on groundwater has a very big human component. So what humans do and how humans adapt to climate change plays a very big role in terms of how groundwater is managed or used, or how climate impacts groundwater. So I'm going to break my talk into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the climate groundwater interactions, and then in the second part, I'm going to talk about human-induced climate groundwater interactions. So now, needless to say, these interactions between groundwater and climate are definitely complex and multifaceted. So I hope I'll give you a good picture of the various interactions that take place between groundwater systems, climates, and what role do humans play in it. So first, I want to talk about how does groundwater affect climate. So groundwater, as we know, is deep under the subsurface. Climate is something that's happening up in the atmosphere. So what is the connection between groundwater that's deep underground and climate that's up on the surface? Well, there are two ways in which we bring this groundwater onto the surface and make it interact with climate. One are we have naturally we do that. There are plants called phreatophytes, mesquite, juniper, other types of tree species. And what they do is they have very deep roots, or if your water table is very shallow, there are other plants that can tap into that groundwater as well. And they bring water to the surface and evaporate it and put it into the atmosphere. So there is that. And then, of course, there is the irrigated agriculture, where we pump water and spray it onto our crops, put it on our crops. And that water now gets to interact with the atmosphere and cause, and that's how there is a direct climate groundwater interaction that takes place. Indirectly, there are other things that happen as humans can increase that water use or decrease that water use depending upon climatic conditions. And also groundwater feeds into rivers and streams in certain places. So that also causes, that can change, depends on how those streams interact with climatic conditions. So there are a lot of indirect interactions, but the direct interactions are when groundwater is brought to the surface and made to interact with the atmospheric system. So groundwater withdrawals add significant amount of water to the atmosphere. So as I said, like, irrigation, the key parameter there is the evapotranspiration. This is the amount of water that's taken up by either water that's on the surface, say in ponds or in springs, but also mostly by plants and transpired or put into the atmosphere. And of course, as we change our land use, there's desertification, deforestation. We change the amount of evapotranspiration that's taking place. And similarly, if we grow crops, we're going to change our evapotranspiration or the amount of water that's transpired into the earth. So the key issue there is when we get rainfall, like we did last night here, there are two parts to that rainfall. One is what's called as the advective precipitation, which is the water that went into the atmosphere someplace else and then moved with the winds and came to your place and condensed and came down. And then the other part is the recycled precipitation, which is the moisture that went up in your region and essentially came back in that region. So you can think of your precipitation being one that's being generated internally through evapotranspiration and one that's coming through advection or coming from neighboring places. So this recycle ratio plays a very important role in terms of how much rainfall you're going to get eventually and what's going to happen to your rainfall patterns. What we are seeing in the U.S. is that in most of arid West North America, which includes Lubbock and Southwest, Western United States, we are actually seeing a decrease in that precipitation ratio. Okay, so we talk about precipitation recycle ratio as this ratio of the recycled amount of precipitation to the total amount of precipitation. Again, Catherine warned me not to put any equations in my slide, but I'll be doing a disservice to engineering if I don't show at least one slide. So she agreed that I could go with one slide. So that's my obligatory engineering slide there, equation. But it basically says how much of that water that you're getting is part of recycle. And those estimates vary quite a bit, but on average, on historical average, that's about 8% of total precipitation. And it's showing a declining trend since the 80s. And that corresponds very well with the amount of the changes in irrigation that have taken place in High Plains region, partly because we went from furrow irrigation or overland irrigation to more sprinkler type irrigation. And that change actually changed our precipitation recycle ratio. On the other hand, we are seeing places like China and Mongolia region, like in another arid region, where we are seeing actually increases in the total amount of recycled water in their precipitation. And that's because China has embarked on very large irrigation projects, like groundwater-based irrigation projects, and they're starting to pick up that some of that water actually is coming back as precipitation recycling. So basically, it changes the advection and the amount of water that's coming from elsewhere to the amount of water that's coming in. Of course, climate plays a very big role on thermal gradients, which in turn affect your wind profiles, your wind velocities, and wind directions. And what we see typically is that most of that irrigated water, Nebraska gets a lot of that recycled water, typically around Texas Panhandle in the vicinity area, Oklahoma, New Mexico, 30% of the water of what we irrigate is recycled back to us. So if we go down and reduce our irrigation, there is a potential for changing our water budgets or the amount of precipitation that comes back to us. So that's a very complex connection between groundwater irrigation and precipitation patterns. Again, a lot of this shows quite a bit of seasonal variability, temporal variability, and in terms of physics, it's a question of how much heat is there in that causes a change of phase, which is the latent heat, vis-a-vis the sensible heat, which increases the temperature of your atmosphere but doesn't quite change the phase. So the thermodynamics kind of govern what that ratio would look like eventually, but amount of ET, the crops grown, the type of irrigation we do, the amount of water we put into the atmosphere, as well as the moisture paths, which are your wind speed and wind profiles, all affect how groundwater interacts with the climate, and how groundwater pumping or lack thereof would affect your rainfall patterns. So what happens to the water that we pump? So the lot of that water essentially goes eastward, most part, and then ends up increasing stream flows in Arkansas, parts of Louisiana, Missouri. So a lot of what we do in this High Plains region actually impacts the amount of precipitation that they're going to see. So as we produce more and more water, because as there is more temperature, as the temperature increases, our ET demands increase. And if we continue pumping water at the rate at which we are pumping, we will start seeing some increased stream flows up in those areas, or flooding in those areas sometimes. So that's kind of the idea behind the groundwater climate interactions, direct interactions, particularly the role of irrigation plays in controlling both the local and the regional precipitation shifts. So that's, to summarize, groundwater, a significant source of ET, especially in arid and semi-arid regions. It's the primary mechanisms through which groundwater systems interact with the atmosphere, and the interplay of ET, temperature, wind patterns impact local and regional precipitation. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk in the later part of my talk about how does climate change impact groundwater systems. So here, there are many things groundwaters can do, particularly if I can change the groundwater depths, which is the water levels. I can change groundwater pressures. The pressures in confined systems, groundwater is held under pressure. So if that pressure changes, there's going to be some loss of sensitive species. If groundwater, we can change the quality of groundwater, particularly post-hurricane recent hurricanes. So what we have seen is that the quality of water, especially in the Gulf Coast, and the groundwater changed quite a bit, because there was quite a bit of runoff that brought in a lot of contaminants, and eventually they seeped into shallow groundwater and contaminated those groundwater sources as well. So, groundwater, you can not only have climate change, not only affects quantity, but it also affects the quality of groundwater. And of course, a lot of groundwater change is associated with changes in land use. Either we are urbanizing, or we are growing more crops to meet food or food demands, or population growth, economic demands, and all that can have impacts. And of course, sea level rise can cause groundwater intrusion. So there are many ways in which climate affects groundwater, depending on where you are. So it can affect the quantity, the quality of the groundwater as well. So recharge is basically the process by which precipitation enters the water. So we looked at how groundwater enters in atmosphere and becomes precipitation. Now we're kind of looking at the reverse of that, seeing how the recharge affects precipitation. Recharge, by and large, can be diffuse or focused. Diffuse recharge is what happens all over the place. Focused recharge is there are special places which are more conducive for that water to percolate and go down. So in West Texas, we have something called the playas. These are natural depressions. The water runs off into these depressions, into these playas, and then they start percolating downward. So there are only two ways the water can move in this playa. Either it can go up into atmosphere and evaporate, or it can percolate down and eventually reach groundwater tables. So, and here I show the network of playas. You can see very dense network of playas in Texas. And then as you go up north, they're called prairie potholes, but essentially they are the same thing. They are natural depressions in the ground with no outlet, basically, so the water either percolates down or goes up. Want to caution that recharge in Ogallala Aquifer is extremely small, particularly in Texas, but a majority of whatever recharge we get is through playas is because they offer a major conduit for recharge. So what does climate change do? Well, we have prolonged droughts. What's the prognosis for this region is that even though our historical average precipitation may not change, the patterns of that precipitation are going to change. So we're going to see very wet years sometimes, and then followed by extremely dry years, more prolonged droughts, which also means that more intensified rain events. And again, if you've lived long enough in Lubbock or any place in the Panhandle, you know that this is very common occurrence, and then this is going to intensify quite a bit because of climate change. And what that does is it enhances erosion. It creates playa sedimentation. So essentially tends to reduce the focused recharge that's taking place. So whatever little recharge we are getting, the prognosis is that in the long run, that is going to go down even further because of the degradation of these playas. So there's a lot of effort going on to keep these playas functional, not only for habitats, but also for recharge purposes. But it does add cost to that little recharge that we're doing that happens to Ogallala Aquifer. Still a very important process. Of course, groundwater is often viewed as a buffer resource because, unlike surface water, they tend to show a slower response. I can never forget in 2011, I got a student from Chile, and I told him we were in the worst single-year drought in the history of Texas. It was really drought. He looks out of Texas Tech and says, where is the drought? I see all the sprinklers going, it's all green. I could tell when the drought happens in Chile, but but that's because we're a groundwater system. So we continue to use groundwater, and because it tends to be more reliable. So typically, as a Texas-wide, if you look at Texas-wide, the groundwater used to the surface water use is about 1.5. During drought years, and it's about 0.75 during wet years. So it does go up quite a bit because it's a buffer resource. So what happens as we start getting more and more frequent droughts? We're going to rely more heavily on groundwater. We're going to pump more groundwater, which means we will lower that water table. And as we lower that water table, it takes so much longer for a drop of water at the surface to percolate down all the way to the water table. So we did some calculations to see how long does it take for a drop of water that's at the root zone, that leaves that root zone and then starts to percolate down to the ground. So this is like a 2015 estimate. For most places, it's over 100 years. And as we decline our water table, it's going to go even further down. So there are places where water can be filled in fairly quickly. These are very shallow portions of the aquifer. The aquifer itself is not very thick because it's right at those edges where you're seeing those blues and maybe greens. But again, those places will be very severely impacted if you have a fairly long-term prolonged drought, like we had in the early part of this decade. Or last decade, I must say. So again, if we think about long-term sustainability of this aquifer, the more water we use, the more difficult it becomes to replenish that water because of the glowing water tables and the time it takes for water to move through that system, through that Vado zone system. And in general, water use correlates fairly well with temperature. But for a long period of time, till about 1980s or so, I'm here showing the water level measurements made mostly by High Plains Water District that we analyzed over a very long period from the 50s, and you will see very sharp declines in most of these wells. These are the wells around this area in the central portion where cotton is grown, and you will see that very steep decline till about mid 80s or so, and then we saw some recovery, but then we started seeing declines. And these shifts that you're seeing were largely because we went from furrow irrigation, spreading water on the ground, to more sprinkler irrigation. So as we transitioned for a few years, we saw some increases in water table That was the old water that kind of percolated down and went to the aquifer. But again, our pumping took over many places. But we are starting to see some more fluctuations in later years. That's because the High Plains Water District changed its water policy. There are more tighter standards, so you will start seeing a little bit more volatility to those time series curves. We are able to see more of the climate effects than we did in the past, because in the past, our impression was that we had a lot of water and we didn't have to worry about what happened to droughts. It was not that there were no droughts here. It's just that humans didn't care about those droughts as much as we do today when we have lesser water. So I also show here what happens if we use climate as an indicator. So 2011 is a very dry year. 2015 is a very wet year. And those red spots are where we are using climate as a surrogate for pumping to see how well climate correlates to pumping. The more green you see, the more accurate are our results. The more red you see, that's the places where our models are starting to deviate. Again, that kind of tells us that there are places where farmers do a lot of different things. So farmers are very heterogeneous. So the general thinking is that people pump groundwater more and more as time goes by. As there is a drought, they tend to rely on groundwater, but that's not always true. So in 2011 drought, some of the farmers stopped pumping, and whereas the other farmers doubled their pumping. So it's a very heterogeneous mix of people and how they use groundwater, and you can see that a little bit more clearly in some of the automated water level monitoring that we have started doing. So I call these the microadaptations that happen during droughts. So there could be, if you have a very prolonged drought, it's easy to plan for that. Farmers do tend to change crops, do tend to adopt conservation measures, tend to use lesser water as we progress into the drought. But part of the problem with droughts are that we never know when we get into a drought, how long that drought is going to last and what's going to happen. So the initial response usually is that we tend to pump more water, but as the drought settles in, people tend to adapt to that reality or make some short-term fixes to those realities, and we start seeing that. So some of the wells, but what happens is if we pump too much during a drought, as I show in that first panel there, we never recover fully back. So even if we curtail our pumping like we did in subsequent droughts, we are still seeing a decline because the effects persist much longer. So groundwater is more an elastic system. It takes a while for it to initiate that drought effects or drought impacts, but once those drought impacts start settling in those groundwater, it takes a lot longer for it to come out of that. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when I talk about climate response to groundwater in Central Texas. So typically the 100th meridian, which kind of runs right in the middle of Texas, essentially tells that the eastern part of that 100th meridian is more humid, the western part is more arid. So this is John Wesley Powell way back in the 1800s, defined that 100th meridian as the line of aridity. What we are seeing with climate change is that 100th meridian, what we are seeing, the climate that we're going to see in 100th meridian and west will shift to about 98th meridian. And the 98th meridian passes right through all major cities in Texas: McAllen, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, at least Dallas Metroplex, so on and so forth. So what we are seeing is a westward movement of aridity in Texas in the long run. And the aquifer that sits there is the Edwards Aquifer. So if you've ever driven through that area, you will see this limestone cutouts as you drive through them. Those are the Edwards Aquifer. Edwards Aquifer is very interesting, one, because that area has very significant population growth, but it also has some very ecologically sensitive or endangered species living in those crevices of those aquifers. And actually, a lot of groundwater regulation in Texas can be attributed to this tiny lizard, the blind salamander, that actually changed the way we regulated. It's to protect the species that we actually were able to develop a lot of very innovative groundwater policies in Texas. So, um, so one of the things about Edwards Aquifer is that Edwards Aquifer is very heavily regulated. As soon as the water level goes down, they start reducing pumpage. They have 4 points. One is in Uvalde County, the J27 well. The J17 well is right in Bexar County. It's right in the middle of San Antonio, actually. And then the Comal Springs and the San Marcos Springs, which you hit as you go on I-35 from San Antonio towards Austin. So those are your 4 trigger points, or 4 places where they look at water levels or spring discharges. So this is the groundwater that's being discharged naturally under pressure to see how this system is responding, and then they have some they go back and use some cutoff limits to say when should people start curtailing pumping and how much pumping has to be curtailed based on what happens. And what we saw was, how does this aquifer respond? And one of the things we saw was that aquifers do provide some buffer to droughts, and this is where I'm showing some plots. The red line is your standardized precipitation index, which is an indicator of meteorological drought. And then the blue line, which tends to be a little bit more smoother and less wavy. This is a similar standardization that's applied to groundwater levels, or this shows the response of groundwater levels. So you will see a lot more volatility in your meteorology or in your rainfall, but you will see much more delayed response, and then much more prolonged response typically with your groundwater system in these wells, in this index well. So how we regulate groundwater to climate change is that we have to understand that groundwaters react slowly, but they react for a longer period of time. So if you are using meteorological measures to regulate groundwater, we can certainly use them as indicators for saying when to put in the policies, when to put in those conservation policies. But just because the meteorological drought is out doesn't necessarily mean that your groundwater also has come back to its original state. As a matter of fact, it might take several months, 10 months or more sometimes, definitely 8 to 10 months in these wells before they come back. The springs come back a little sooner than the wells, but in generally, it takes several months for that response to be fully washed out of groundwater systems. So we're also looking at risk analysis, looking at future climate scenarios, and seeing what is the risk of being in one of those failure states. Failure state is when you have to put in some sort of a conservation measure. You cannot pump as much as you are allowed to pump. And so what we typically see is that the risk goes up for several scenarios, although it varies quite a bit. Definitely, it goes up for most of the models and most of the downscaled data that we have gotten from a variety of different models. Here we used about 40 different climate change models under various scenarios. Same thing, the failure duration. This is how long, once a failure sets in, how long will that system stay under the failure state? Or like, once I get into a conservation mode, how long will I have to stay in that conservation mode? Again, we are seeing about 96% of the models say that that's going to be more than your historical mean, which is shown in that red line there. So both the mode of failure as well as the duration of the failures are going to increase in this climate hotspot because of climate change, which has very profound implications on one of the fastest growing areas, not just in Texas, but elsewhere in the world. Again, if you go across the world, Texas is a microcosm of what happens in the world. We see very similar things happening in China and India, two very largest users of water in association with the United States. Pakistan, fairly small country, but heavily groundwater dependent. Western portions of it are very arid. So their groundwater production is also very high. Same thing with Iran. So you're seeing that South Asia and Southeast Asia, huge reliance, very large reliance on groundwater, particularly because they are becoming more, there is more rural electrification, there is more solar, There is more ways of getting energy to pull that water out of the ground, and that is causing some very significant declines. In parts of India, there is more than 1 meter per year decline, which basically means that there is about 10 or 20 years left if business as usual continues, if we start pumping as usual in these areas. So to kind of conclude, some concluding remarks: groundwater is a buffer resource. It's a better quality, it's a more reliable resource, especially during droughts. So we tend to use it more. But how we use groundwater impacts climate, and what happens to climate impacts groundwater. And humans have a very big role to play in maintaining that balance or sustaining that groundwater resources for future generations, because it can have a two-way interactions with the climate system. Of course, I will leave you all with a very famous quote by Benjamin Franklin, which I love. Talks about knowing the value of water when the well goes dry. And since this is Science by the Glass, can anyone here, this is a karst formation, and you can see me sitting all smiling because I'm close to a karst. I'm inside groundwater for the first time, or very close to groundwater for the first time, and can someone tell me, does anybody know what Lynchburg, Tennessee is famous for?
Go ahead and type it in the chat if you know what Lynchburg, Tennessee is famous for. Oh, we got one.
And?
Yeah, we got two.
And?
And are they correct?
What are they? I didn't see the chat.
Oh, it's whiskey and Jack Daniels.
Correct. And the reason why Scotland is very famous for whiskey, and so is Tennessee, is because of the karst formations. Karst formations have very little iron and manganese in them, and removing those was the biggest problem. You could naturally not remove them. There was a lot of dissolved iron which would precipitate out once you made whiskey, and you put them in the vat, it would all precipitate out and make the whiskey bitter. So Indians could never make whiskey because they didn't have karst formations, or large karst formations. It took them almost 50 years. Very recently, they have come up with a process because they essentially take the water and remove all the iron and manganese and make that water. The reason Scotland and Tennessee, places were very big, is because of whiskey. And if the Scottish people had come into Texas, we would have had big distilleries in around Edwards Aquifer, instead of Germans coming in and making breweries and beer. So that would be an interesting snippet on why the impacts of groundwater on our drinking habits, other beverages. So with that, I'll conclude and open it up for any questions.
All right. Well, that is going to be the thing I remember forever, is that groundwater is responsible for good quality whiskey. I had
correct. No idea. Yes, there's one takeaway from this.